Hello to everybody, and welcome to our Bible study today dealing with the book of Ecclesiastes. Today we are in Lesson 5 in the Workbook series that we've been following. As we look at Mike Willis's work on the book of Ecclesiastes, we're looking at Lesson 5, which is entitled Exhortations Regarding Worship, Oppression, and Riches. And the text is going to come from the first 20 verses of Ecclesiastes chapter 5. In looking at the questions that the author poses for us, he says, what danger is to be avoided as we look at verse 1 in chapter 5, which says, keep thy foot when thou goest to the house of God, and be more ready to hear than to give the sacrifice of fools, for they consider not that they do evil. The point that I think Solomon is warning us about here is that we should take care as we go to worship God, that we truly are able to worship, as Jesus said in John chapter 4, to worship in spirit and in truth, as opposed to giving what Solomon calls the sacrifice of fools, that being an insincere, unlawful worship, that are only fools expressing themselves in an irreverent, disobedient kind of way. God expects us to look at His Word. God has always given strict instruction as to how He wanted to be worshipped. We could look at the book of Leviticus at the story of Nadab and Abihu. And when they offered strange fire and the burning of incense, God sent fire from heaven and destroyed them. So the point was that God expects worship to be as He has prescribed it. It is not according to our desires, our likes, our wants. Often today, worship services in various religious circles are simply constructed to appeal to the passions of man, to make man feel good, to get him all pumped up and to get him excited. But many times, I'm afraid, if we actually analyze the activities going on, it would fall into that category of what Solomon says here. It's the sacrifice of fools. It's unlawful. It is not in accordance with divine instruction. It is a worship service geared more to the needs and wants of man rather than a reverent obedience to the commands that God has given. And so Solomon is giving us warning about that from the very beginning of this 5th chapter of Ecclesiastes. In question 2, he said, what makes the sacrifice of fools displeasing to God? Well, as he kind of implies here, there is an unwillingness to hear and a refusal to acknowledge their own personal sins. Notice what he says in the last phrase of the verse, for they consider not that they do evil. They simply want to hear the things that are pleasing to them. They want to hear the things that would be smooth instruction that would make them feel comfortable about themselves. Individuals who want to hear those smooth things, and certainly no preaching that is going to convict them. Certainly no preaching that is going to make them see that they need to make changes and that they need to make improvement in their lives. They don't want to have any part of that instruction. And so that becomes the sacrifice of fools. Just tell me what I want to hear. Tell me the things that are pleasing unto me. You know, Paul, when he was talking to Timothy over in 2 Timothy chapter 4, talked about the importance of preaching the word. He says in 2 Timothy 4 and verse 1, I charge thee therefore before God and the Lord Jesus Christ, who shall judge the quick and the dead at his appearing in his kingdom. Preach the word. Be instant in season and out of season. Reprove, rebuke, and exhort with all longsuffering and doctrine. For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but after their own lusts shall they heap to themselves teachers having itching ears. And they shall turn away their ears from the truth, and shall be turned unto fables. So in the long ago, Solomon was giving warning about this, that it's important that we keep the focus on God when we worship, and that we do not bend those worship experiences simply to appeal to the carnal appetites of men. Otherwise, we're just going through the motions, and our heart is far away from obedience to God. In question 3, what does verse 2 recommend about prayer? In verse 2, he says, be not rash with thy mouth, and let not thine heart be hasty to utter anything before God. For God is in heaven, and thou upon earth. Therefore let thy words be few. The point that he's making here is that we should not be rash or hasty in our praying to God, where it's something kind of, shall we say, off the cuff without any forethought, simply the recitation of a bunch of set phrases where we may not even remember where we are in the memorized recitation that we want to set forth. God hears our prayers. He wants to hear the intents of our heart. And we've got to strive to be as honest and genuine about that as we possibly can be. Over in 1 Peter chapter 3 and going down to verse 12, we are reminded that God does pay attention, that God does hear our prayers. In 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 12, he says, "For the eyes of the Lord are over the righteous, and his ears are open unto their prayers. But the face of the Lord is against them that do evil." So there needs to be forethought in the things that we say in our prayers. Not just to be very verbose or use a lot of words and a long, impressive prayer. Jesus talked about that in his Sermon on the Mount, that there were some who wanted to be seen for their much praying and for the showmanship that they put into that. Over in Matthew chapter 6 and beginning in verse 1, he said, "Take heed, therefore, that you do not your alms before men to be seen of them. Otherwise ye have no reward of your Father which is in heaven. Therefore when thou doest thine alms, do not sound a trumpet before thee, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have glory of men. Verily I say unto you, they shall have their reward. But when thou doest alms, let not thy left hand know what thy right hand doeth, that thine alms may be in secret, and thy Father which seeth in secret himself shall reward thee openly. And when thou prayest, thou shalt not be as the hypocrites are, for they love to pray, standing in the synagogues and in the corners of the streets, that they may be seen of men. Verily I say unto you, they have their reward. But thou, when thou prayest, enter into thy closet, and when thou hast shut thy door, pray to thy Father which is in secret, and thy Father which seeth in secret shall reward thee openly. And when you pray, use not vain repetitions as the heathen do, for they think they shall be heard for their much speaking. Be not ye therefore like unto them, for your Father knoweth what things ye have need of before ye ask him." So Jesus helps us understand here more clearly what Solomon's talking about in Ecclesiastes 5 and verse 2. Solomon says, "Be not rash with thy mouth, and let not thine heart be hasty to utter anything before God." In other words, think about what you're saying. Make it honest, make it sincere from the heart. "For God is in heaven, and thou upon earth. Therefore let thy words be few." It's not a chance to be a showman. It's not like Jesus talked about there in Matthew of the individual who wants to be heard for his much speaking. Simply, honestly, and carefully lay before God the petitions of your heart and pray to him in spirit and in truth. Going down to question 4, he said, what is the comparison that he uses in verse 3? Well, here in verse 3 of Ecclesiastes 5, he said, "For a dream cometh through the multitude of business, and a fool's voice is known by a multitude of words." The point here, if we look at some of the background of the language here, it's a little maybe unclear to the first read. It's the excessive work that can so lay upon our hearts that it leads us to restless dreams. A dream cometh through the multitude of business. We just lay awake at night, or the dreams that we have are our subconscious still chewing away on the problems of the day. And then he compares that to the fool who thinks that he needs to be going on and on and on and on in his rambling speech. He fluffs it up with a bunch of meaningless chatter just to have something to say. A fool's voice is known by his multitude of words. So it simply is a matter of our putting some forethought into what we say, and some forethought into what we pray, and that we worship God with a sincere heart, focusing on all the right things. In question 5, he says, read Deuteronomy 23, verses 21 through 23, and Numbers chapter 30 and verse 2, and summarize the law's teaching regarding vows. This is going back to what Solomon would be referencing, applicable to the day and time in which he lived. This is the law of God in the Ten Commandments relative to the offering of vows. In Deuteronomy 23, beginning in verse 21, Moses, in talking about this, says, "And when thou shalt vow a vow unto the Lord thy God, thou shalt not be slack to pay it. For the Lord thy God will surely require it of thee, and it would be sin in thee. But if thou shalt forbear to vow, it shall be no sin to thee." You may have to put it off a little bit, but God does expect you to come through with the things that you have promised unto him. Over in Numbers chapter 30 and going down to verse 2, we find as well the law of Moses talking about this idea of offering vows. It says in verse 2 of Numbers 30, "If a man vow a vow unto the Lord, or swear an oath to bind his soul with a bond, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceedeth out of his mouth." So the point he is making is that vows must be kept, and we must do what we say, or it's like the old adage should be, our word should be our bond. He said, you shall not break your word. The promises that you've made, the vows that you've taken, you're expected to live up to those, both unto God and even unto men. We should be people of an honest report, individuals who keep their word. In question 6, what does Solomon say about vows here in this passage in Ecclesiastes? What is he saying about the details of our vows and how we offer them to God and the obligation that rests upon us as we think about fulfilling them? In verse 4 continuing, "When thou vowest a vow unto God, defer not to pay it, for he hath no pleasure in fools. Pay that which thou hast vowed. Better is it that thou shouldest not vow, than that thou shouldest vow and not pay. Suffer not thy mouth to cause thy flesh to sin. Neither say thou before the angel that it was an error. Wherefore should God be angry at thy voice, and destroy the work of thine hands? For in the multitude of dreams and many words there are also divers vanities. But fear thou God." He said you can't make a vow and say, "Oops, I take it all back. I really didn't mean that." He's saying whenever you vow a vow, whenever you make a promise to God or to man, think about what you're promising and then follow it through. He said it's better not to make a promise than to make one that you are going to know full well you're not going to be able to keep it. Rash vows, he says, are sinful. "Suffer not thy mouth to cause thy flesh to sin. Neither say thou before the angel that it was an error. Wherefore should God be angry at thy voice, and destroy the work of thine hands." So we need to pay attention to the things that we promise. Sometimes we are prone to want to bargain with God. We have an emergency that crops up, and God, if you'll just get me out of this jam, then I promise I'll go to church, or I'll promise I'll become a Christian, or I'll get my life right. Just help my mom to get well from her illness, or just... And so we begin to try and bargain with God, making these promises, and then God fulfills that which we desire. But guess what? We forget all about the promises that we made of what we were going to do if God would simply respond to us. So these are examples that help us understand the gist of what Solomon is teaching here. That God is not to be bargained with. The promises that we make are to be kept, and we need to put forethought into the things that we pledge ourselves to do. In question 7, he said, why is the man in verse 4 judged to be a fool? In verse 4, "When thou vowest a vow unto God, defer not to pay it, for he hath no pleasure in fools. Pay that which thou hast vowed." A rash vow without forethought is a sign of the ways of the foolish. They'll say anything. They'll do anything. They will try anything to be able to get ahead, to get an advantage, or to get their way. And they fail to consider the consequences of the things that they commit themselves to do. Nothing is serious with them. There is no bond to their word of honesty and fulfillment. I'm just going to say whatever it takes. And that's the way of the fool. In Proverbs 18 and verse 7, it says, "A fool's mouth is his destruction, and his lips are the snare of his soul." The fool simply does not pay any attention to the seriousness of the promises that he is making. And Solomon here exposes that folly. In question 8, it says, "When might men be likely to make rash vows?" Well, if we benefit from the story of Jephthah, one of the judges of Israel, we find him making a rather foolish vow. When he said, "If God will give me victory in battle and let me come home again, I will offer and sacrifice the first thing that comes out to greet me." He never dreamed that the first thing to come out to meet him was his own daughter. Often we can make these vows and not think about the consequences of them. And we are very prone to make those rash promises to God, those rash vows, whenever we're trying to get something from God. Just give me this benefit, give me this blessing, and this is what I will do. And then so often we forget, or we simply choose not to remember that which we have promised God that we would do. In question 9, what 2 reasons did Solomon give to comfort himself in the face of oppression? That was a big issue with Solomon, seeing the unfairness of this life, the oppression that occurs. And so here he talks about it a little bit more. We notice some of it in the last chapter as well. But here in verse 8, he says, "If thou seest the oppression of the poor, and violent perverting of judgment, and justice in a providence, marvel not at the matter, for he that is higher than the highest regardeth, and there be higher than they." Here's the point Solomon's making. Sometimes we get all upset about the oppression that we see around us and how unfair it is. But Solomon says, to each individual there is a higher power. Yes, maybe your boss is cruel and difficult to work with and unfair and makes your life miserable every day. But guess what? He has a boss too. There is an owner to the company. There's a hierarchy of those folks who are in control. And whenever their oppression eventually comes to light, there'll be a consequence for their unfairness and the way they behave. It may be a long time in coming, but it will happen in God's good time. But even if he decides not to visit that iniquity here on this earth and correct it to our observation, even though several levels of leadership may be corrupt, as Solomon acknowledges here, there is a power even higher than man at all. That's the power of God. And as Paul teaches us in Romans chapter 12, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord." So there is an ultimately higher power who will take care of all of those oppressors, whether it's an oppressor of the poor, whether it is the violent individual who perverts judgment to have his way. There's a lot of applications of oppression and unfairness in this life. But leave it with God. He will take care of that. "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord." In question 10, what is Solomon's affirmation in verse 9? He says, "Moreover, the profit of the earth is for all. The king himself is served by the field." The point that he makes is that the earth is for everybody. We have a tremendous surge amongst human beings for power. They want to gain power and control. They want to be in positions of power where they can direct the affairs of everyone else. They're even like a king or like in government, that I want to have control. And the point that is being made here, as Solomon is making it out to us, is to help us understand that the higher powers are also not only answerable to those that they are under. In other words, there's going to be payback for what they do, but God is also there to say he has an interest in seeing justice served. The earth is for everybody. We should be looking out for one another's best interests. Even the king only holds on to his power by the agreement of his subjects to be subject unto him. that could breed, his unfairness can breed a rebellion that completely takes his throne away from him. So Solomon is making the point here in verse 9. He said, the profit, and moreover, the profit of the earth is for all. Everyone has their rights. There are certain inalienable rights, as our founding documents in this country said. And the king himself is served by the field. He has an interest in seeing justice served. He needs to have a care about the happiness of his subjects, because it always can blow back on him if he ignores such. In question 11, why is the man who loves silver never satisfied with silver? That's what Solomon talks about in verse 10. He that loveth silver shall not be satisfied with silver, nor he that loveth abundance with increase. This also is vanity. Regardless how much silver we pile up, it's never going to be enough. Regardless how much we have in terms of wealth, there is that insatiable desire to want to have more, because riches simply do not have the capacity to give us fulfillment. It's not going to give us satisfaction. Even in the parable that Jesus told of the rich fool, he had more than his heart could desire, but still he didn't manage it well. He didn't thank God for what he had. He didn't care about the affairs of others. He simply was worried about, I'll build bigger barns, I guess, and I'll take care of my abundance that way, rather than seeing the other options that could have been open to him. Continuing on in question 12, the author asks, what happens when a man's goods increase? Well, notice the lasting phrases here in verse 10. He that loveth abundance with increase. In other words, he shall never be satisfied. Let's back up and put the whole verse together. He that loveth silver shall not be satisfied with silver, nor he that loveth abundance with increase. In other words, he's always going to want more. He's not going to be satisfied. His millions need to be billions. His wealth needs to continue to increase. But we don't need to put it all up at that super high end of the spectrum. We can be just as covetous with a small amount that we've been given the stewardship of. We can be so obsessed with trying to scrimp and save and miserly hold on to every penny, to exploit others and do all that we can to build up maybe even a few $100s to the expense of our own soul and to the mistreatment of other people. All of this happens because, as Paul told Timothy, the love of money is the root of all evil. It can get the better of us. In question 13, what value do increased goods give to the owner? And here is a point that is often missed. We tend to think that that rich person has no problem. He has all of the issues of life, solved, and he has no cares in the world at all. But let's listen to Solomon's comment in verse 11. When goods increase, they are increased that eat them. And what good is there to the owners thereof, saving the beholding of them with their eyes? Oh, it might be nice to look at a nice big house and maybe several fancy cars. That might give us a fleeting moment of pleasure. But with the increase in wealth is also the increase of obligations. Yes, you may own lavish estates, but now you have to hire more servants to take care, more workers to take care of all of your holdings. More and more employees have got to be paid to maintain the abundance that you have. And then on top of that is the constant fear and worry that somebody may take it away from you, that you may make a wrong decision, enter into a bad deal, and suddenly all of your wealth disappears. So the rich person also has obligations. He has workers to take care of. He has his own set of fears and concerns. So don't ever believe that the individual who is on the more affluent end of the spectrum has no issues or no problems and no worries. He just has a different set. In question 14, he says, contrast the laboring man with the rich man. In verse 12, Solomon says, the sleep of a laboring man is sweet, whether he eateth little or much, but the abundance of the rich will not suffer him to sleep. The point that Solomon is making is the laboring man works and then he rests well. He eats within his means. He may not have a massive banquet, but he has enough to eat. God takes care of him and he manages. On the other hand, the rich man, he doesn't have to worry about food on the table, but he is plagued with worries and he doesn't sleep well because he's carrying a whole nother set of issues that he's got to cope with. In question 15, in what ways can riches harm the owners? Well, there are several verses that they give us to help us think about this. The first one is here in verse 13. There is a sore evil which I have seen under the sun, namely riches kept for the owners thereof to their hurt. But those riches perish by evil travail. He said these riches can come back to bite you. There are individuals who are blessed with a whole lot of wealth, but they mismanage it. They do not handle it correctly, and as a result, they wind up suffering for it. Over in James chapter 5 and going down to verse 3, he said, your gold and silver is cankered, and the rust of them shall be a witness against you, and shall eat your flesh as it were fire. Ye have heaped treasure together for the last days. There are individuals who have been corrupted because of their incessant searching after riches, but their gold and silver isn't going to benefit them. It's cankered and tarnished. The rust is going to set up even on those precious possessions that they have purchased, because one day those riches will all slip away from the holder. We're not going to be able to take it with us, as we often use the phrase, and all of those riches are going to go to somebody else. And if that's been our preoccupation in life, what will our eternity be? In Matthew chapter 19, beginning in verse 16, we find here the story of this rich young ruler that came to Jesus. He came and said unto him, good master, what good thing shall I do that I may have eternal life? And Jesus told him to keep the commandments, and he proudly said, well, I've been doing that. And then Jesus says in verse 19, continuing, or verse 20, the young man saith unto him, all these things have I kept from my youth up. What lack I yet? And Jesus said unto him, if thou wilt be perfect, go and sell that thou hast, and give to the poor, and thou shalt have treasure in heaven, and come and follow me. And when the young man heard that saying, he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. The possessions actually were possessing him. He was so obsessed with his money that he could not part with it, even if it affected his eternal salvation. Paul told Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 17, to charge them that are rich in this world, that they be not high-minded, nor trust in uncertain riches, but in the living God, which gives us richly all things to enjoy. That they do good, and that they be rich in good works, ready to distribute and willing to communicate, laying up in store for themselves a good foundation against the time to come, that they may lay hold on eternal life. In question 16, what danger will confront the rich man that is discussed in verse 14 here in Ecclesiastes chapter 5? The rich man is constantly on the lookout for what could be a problem, what could be the next issue that he's got to face. And in verse 14 he says, but those riches perish by evil travail, and he begetteth a son, and there is nothing in his hand. These riches can perish by evil travail, or the English Standard Version says they can lose them through bad ventures. You can make that bad investment, and suddenly that wealth is gone, and then he has nothing left for his son, nothing left for his heirs, because the wealth he accumulated slipped right through his fingers. In question 17, what will be man's financial condition at his death? In verses 15 and 16, Solomon says, and he came forth of his mother, and as he came forth of his mother's womb, naked shall he go as he came out, and shall take nothing of his labor that he may carry away in his hand. And this also is a sore evil, that in all points as he came, so shall he go. And what profit hath he that hath labored for the wind? You wind up leaving this earth with nothing in terms of financial gain. As Job said, naked I came into this world, and naked I shall return. There's nothing. There's no financial gain. that he's going to take with him. It's all going to be left behind whenever an individual leaves this life. In question 18, how is the rich man's life described in verse 17? It said, all of his days also he eateth in darkness, and he hath much sorrow and wrath with his sickness. His life is going to be filled with its own set of struggles, its own travail. That's what it means with the idea of eating in darkness. There's always a cloud over him. Maybe it is the regret of not rearing his children properly. Maybe it is having such shifting values that he can't hold a marriage together, that he's made bad business decisions and his wealth all disappears. There are so many things that can produce sorrow and wrath and this sickness, as it's called here. So don't ever delude yourself into thinking that the rich have no problems, they have no issues, and they have nothing that causes them to suffer. In question 19, what exhortation is given in these last few verses, verses 18 through 20? It says, behold that which I have seen. It is good and comely for one to eat and to drink, and to enjoy the good of all of his labor that he taketh under the sun, all the days of his life which God giveth him, for it is his portion. Every man also to whom God hath given riches and wealth, and hath given him power to eat thereof, and to take his portion, and to rejoice in his labors, this is the gift of God. For he shall not much remember the days of his life, because God answereth him in the joy of his heart. Both the poor and the rich should simply enjoy what they have in this life. As Solomon says here, it is the gift of God. Enjoy those good moments that are here, because when we leave this life, all of this will be a memory that fades quickly away. Heaven's going to be so much better than anything we could have had here. And so whenever we set our priorities in the right order and set our affections on things above, a much better life is coming, even if we lived an affluent lifestyle while we were here. In question 20, it says, list the other passages that we have previously studied that give the same advice as in these last few verses. Well, we read over in Ecclesiastes 2 and verse 24, there is nothing better for a man than he should eat and drink, that he should make his soul enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw, that it was from the hand of God. Over in the 3rd chapter and verse 13, and also that every man should eat and drink, and enjoy the good of all of his labor. It is the gift of God. And down in chapter 3 and verse 22, wherefore I perceive that there is nothing better than a man should rejoice in his own works, for that is his portion. For who shall bring him to see what shall be after him? Be happy in the moment. Be happy with what you got. You just don't know what's on down the road, so be thankful for your daily bread. In the true-false section, it says, number 1, the prevalence of divorce is a testimony to the lightness with which people make vows before God. And that's true. We find that Malachi reminds us that God is a witness to the marriage vows that we exchange. And for us to lightly break those vows is simply an illustration, yet again, of what Solomon is saying. You make vows, and you must keep the vows that you have made. In question 2, God is pleased with any sacrifice that man may make. Well, no. Over in the chapter here in this 5th chapter in verse 1, he talks about the sacrifice of fools, where a person thinks he's sacrificing, thinks he's offering the right things, but if he's not doing it with the right heart and doing it in the right way, it avails him nothing. Over in question 3, the foolishness of trusting in riches is seen in that they can easily perish. Well, that's true. That wealth can go away very, very quickly. Here in the 5th chapter and going down to verse 14, he says, but those riches perish by evil travail. In question 4, wealthy people often become miserable trying to protect their riches from others. And that's true. As he says up there in verse 12, the sleep of a laboring man is sweet, neither whether he eat little or much, but the abundance of the rich will not suffer him to sleep. He has too much on his mind, too many things to worry about. And then the 5th one, to be wealthy is a sin? Well, no. We talked about that from New Testament passages. Paul told Timothy to tell folks who are rich, charge them that are rich, here's what you do with your riches to handle them correctly. So number 1 was true, number 2 was false, number 3 was true, number 4 was true, and number 5 was false in the true false section. And then he says, complete these verses based on the King James Version. Then Jesus said unto his disciples, verily I say unto you, that a rich man can hardly enter the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 19:23. And then the second one, for we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain that we can carry nothing out. 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 7. And in the last one, in the multitude of words there wanteth not sin, but he that refraineth his lips is wise. Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 19. So we've had a chance today to look at yet some more of the wisdom of Solomon as he's talked to us about understanding a proper framework for our worship, to worship in spirit and in truth, or according to God's instructions, and that we understand the importance of the promises that we make, that the contracts that we sign, the promises that we made, we are to fulfill those, if at all possible, as much as lieth in us, because we are to live up to the promises that we have made. Oppression does occur, and so God's going to be the one to take care of that. There's higher powers even between this individual and God, who also can take a hand to straighten out the oppressors in this world. But eventually God will judge. And then we also saw some more references to the rich, to help us understand that they are not so abundantly blessed that they are immune from worry and care, the worry of possibly losing their wealth, the worry of making a bad investment and losing everything so their children have nothing. Solomon gives us a lot more to think about as we order our priorities in this life so that we can live soberly, righteously, and godly in this present world. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you next time as we study our next lesson out of the book of Ecclesiastes.